Hi, Sam. Recording to begin. As the chair of the Plant Conservation Alliance, Droege grew up in Hyattsville, received an undergraduate degree at the University of Maryland and a master's at the State University of New York, Syracuse. Most of his career has been spent at the U.S. Geological Survey Patuxent Wildlife Research Center. He has coordinated the North American Breeding Birds Survey Program, developed the North American Amphibian Monitoring Program, the BioBlitz, Cricket and Frog Watch USA programs, and worked on the design of monitoring program. Currently, he is developing an inventory and monitoring program for native bees, online identification guides for North American bees, and with Jessica Zelt, reviving the North American Bird Phenology Program. Without further ado, speaking to us about replacing lawns with native plant communities, the native bee perspective, let's welcome Sam Droege. I give you the floor.
Thanks, Patricia. I'm going to flip right to the talk because we got a lot of ground to cover. Screen, I can do this correctly. And that. Okay. Do people see a Flickr Instagram slide?
Yes.
Okay, all right, we're good. So here's my contact information. I'm going to repeat this later. You can do screen grabs or take a shot of those, or you can also contact me via my email address, and I have many links to probably more things than you want, but I'm happy to send those and share those. We'll mention and show very quickly a couple of things that probably will be best shared by email. Okay, so we're going to talk about lawns, but in the bigger picture, we're really talking about planting strategies, how to think about any situation where you want to recover, augment, pollinator garden, pollinator meadow. What is it that you put there for bees? And it's always going to be about plants. So this is really an appropriate audience. And because the audience tends to be sophisticated, as far as I can tell, maybe I should say it is sophisticated. I can tell that. We're going to get into a little more nitty gritty in terms of some of the species groups to have as examples, because I'm really going to, during the talk, emphasize that we need to get out beyond the normal seed mixes and to think a little more regionally and a little more in depth about what it is that actually is most important for the conservation of bees. Okay, I'm just throwing that out there to be a little bit antagonistic. We will return to that topic just to stir the pot. I also need to mention honeybees. Honeybees are wild species are not at all like honeybees. Everything you know about honeybees, none of that is going to occur in our native species. And that when you think about saving bees or helping bees, if you're helping honeybees, this is a shortcut of a much longer conversation. You are hurting wild bees. That's pretty much the nut of those arguments. That's an entire 2 talks to get into the details. I have links to papers and things if you're interested in that topic that you can then read up on later. Okay, this does not occur in nature, yet this is one of the perhaps the largest amount of acreage of any kind of crop or landform in North America. And we're talking about repatriating some of these areas as a theme. Okay, again, we have this larger theme, which is what gets planted, what doesn't. But the theme is, let's try and flip as much of this as possible. And there's cultural elements to that, which we're not going to dive in deeply because this is about plants and some of the nitty gritty. And this is what that lawn replaced, right? So at one point, that lawn, any lawn really, was part of this large biodiverse network of plants. And those plants had with them, in addition to bees, a whole ton of, that's a very scientific, a big ton of biodiversity that was dependent on those plants. And because they had all this time, they divided up the world very finely. So you lose many, many different kinds of groups of bees, but other species too, if you select only a small number of flowering plants. And furthermore, if you are selecting only non-native or largely non-native components, then you lose even more. You're selecting for generalist bees, which are basically so rugged that they're going to be fine. We look at Google wildflower pollinator mixes or things like that, and even some of the big groups are going to give you what I call a big box solution, which is these are wildflowers. By our definition, they're cheap to gather and manufacture. They will yield something pretty that fits a fairy tale definition of what a pollinator garden should look like. It is not necessarily, well, it is not going to be the solution. It is the same solution that you would have for bird conservation. If you said, I put up a whole bunch of bird feeders, end of the problem of bird conservation. So this is essentially the analog. This is the bird feeding station solution to pollinators. Yes, you will have more birds if you put up bird feeders. Check that box. And yes, you'll have more pollinators if you put in this kind of mix, but neither approach supports the populations of birds or pollinators. It simply attracts them, some, and not the component we're looking at. Here's another example. You'll see, and there are good mixes out there. So Xerxes Society has good links to some groups that have put together pretty sophisticated sets. The main thing to think about, though, is often you have thousands of species in North America, and the solution package is often given to you through a commercial firm as a very small subset of that. And those tend to be common, easy to grow, easy to produce, inexpensive, and you should be thinking about how do we depart from that, because that solution has been made. We need the solution that best fits the conservation of uncommon species. In general, so there's, this is complicated, just like birds are complicated. Specialist bees are our problem, vulnerable conservation ones. These are bees that, by our definition, can be defined differently, are working at a family level or less. And by working at, I'm talking about they use pollen. So all bees need pollen for their success. The nectar component that most of them use, not all, is relatively generic. So they can pull nectar from lots of plants. This is the milkweed MO, right? Milkweed provides no pollen to bees. They provide tons of nectar. Everyone's there at the 7-Eleven tanking up, and they're dragging pollen around by accident for the milkweed. But if we look at what do those bees need, they need a pollen source, which is often rich in all sorts of chemical repellents, different fractions of protein, lipids, and fats that are used by bees, and sometimes even outright toxic to different groups of bees. Even the most generic of all bees, honeybees, have preferences within this large tableau of really yummy kinds of foods, but way more picky than, say, humans are at that. And in fact, if you start swapping pollen loads between species, everybody dies, meaning the babies really require a certain kind of food. So this is perhaps one of the most important slides, maybe the most important slide in this talk. So Jared Fowler has put together 3 sets of compilations of bee-host relationships and for the East, Central, and Western states. It's incomplete because our understanding of bees is incomplete. We have species that are undescribed that we know about, not described yet. So we're way behind. We additionally think some things are specialists, and they may not be. They may be a little more loose with their pollen use. And we have other species that should be on this list, but we just don't have the evidence lined up. But what will happen is on, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but over this host plant side, you will see these different groups, and I'm going to split that out later into some subsets. It's not just simply Asteraceae does it all. It's groups within it, but this gives you a look and feel and a starting place. And you can go over here to the bee species and click on that link, and often you'll see evidence based on collections of what that plant is actually using. You have to be careful because sometimes their use is defined as I caught that bee on that plant, and that could be the bee. The reason the bee was there could be I just was stopping for a little 7-Eleven drink on that milkweed. Maybe milkweed is important, maybe not, probably not actually. So I don't want to go too far down these rabbit holes, but that list, and it goes on and on, will give you some of the plant groups that are important to be thinking about. Mostly they're not uncommon groups, but sometimes they are. Like, for example, Grassa parnassus. I didn't even know that plant existed, let alone a group has its own species that only goes to Grassa parnassus. So another big chunk here I want people to be aware of is that if you live in an area or work or want to recover or plant or flip your lawn at a place that has or once was deep sand, that's your you have extra work to do. And by extra work, I mean that there are bees that are endemic to these deep sand areas that need to be thought about even more. So a solution in your mind that puts vegetation completely back on sand, almost always bad. A lot of these endemic species require open sand to nest in, as do plants and other species too, for that matter. And you talk about burn regimes and uncommon sand-loving plants. We may not know exactly who is using what, but we do know that there are many bees that are restricted to these deep sands. So if you're dune edge, lakeshore edge, sand hills, kinds of things, keep a lot of that vegetation off, look at what's growing there, emphasize the augmentation of some of these uncommon plant groups that tend to have endemic bees on them. Okay, I'm going to go through just some examples of species that have specialist bees on them. That is often not in the trade, have cool stories, things that just to sort of expand your horizons in terms of thinking about these things outside of normal seed mixes. So here, for example, in the east, in these deep sand areas, relevant to the last slide, Maryland golden aster, Chrysopsis, lots and lots of records of really interesting bees on that particular species of plant. Another interesting one is Lionea. So Lionea maleberry is the most common one. There's a couple other species that I'm aware of in the east, has several different specialist bees, all of which are very rarely seen or recorded. Some of that may be that no one's collecting off of Lionea, but Lionea is not a huge component of the environment. It's a lovely shrub. Instead of planting other ericaceous shrubs or some weird foundation planting, moving into finding and growing Lionea and other things that we'll be talking about here is something to start thinking about, right? We have certain plants that we like to plant because they're in the commercial trades. Those of you who are in commercial trades should be looking at some of these other species groups and getting out of the, scribbling out of the box that's already out there for what are important plants for bees. Even within Vaccinium, you have deerberry, has its own set of species that are only going to deerberry, not to the other Vacciniums. We have another example, the cranberries have their own set of bees, only going to cranberry types of Vacciniums. Maybe they've split the Vacciniums up once again into something else, but we have the more common Vacciniums that are, commercially important, and those have a whole series of bees, which now farmers are they orchardists, berryists, are incorporating into their strategies for pollination, much more efficient than honeybees. Also, I should point out, honeybees really hate ericaceous shrubs because they have poriferous stamens that have to be sonicated, or they have to be waggled, basically, sung to by the right tone by native bees, including bumblebees. Again, I have to stop myself from talking too much about these or we'll never get through. Willows, super important, wetland plant, many species, Adendrina in Maryland alone that are specialists on that particular group. Really interesting things going on there. Oddball things, Agellinus has specialist bees on them, even though it's mostly an annual. The shrub cornus groups, the shrubby dogwoods, have a whole set of bees that only go to them, but don't go to Cornus Florida, and probably a couple other of the bigger ones. We have pickerelweed way out in the middle of flooded wetlands that has that beautiful purple stalk that's saying something to some kind of pollinator. And indeed, what we've seen so far is 3 specialist bees that literally only go to that one species of plant. No pickerelweed, those bees are gone. Enothera, you think about some of these strategies that plants have, blooming only in the evening. What's that about? Well, it turns out there's a set of bees that only come out in the evening and can deal with the very gummy byssal threads of Enothera plants. And spring beauties, this brings up the larger picture of woodlands as very important communities for bees. If you have ever been in a beautiful forest full of spring blooming wildflowers, there is an equally large number of bees exploiting that, and many of them are specialists on particular plants. Lysomachia, our native loosestrifes, super interesting because they produce oils which are used by a set of bees that replace largely nectar with oil in their mixes, and seemingly a lot less common, at least the species of bees are. And we look for them a lot, and we have found very few. And it may be, it's a little mysterious. The loosestrife is still around, but perhaps less than before. So it's a put it in the planting mix. Weedy stuff like ground cherries, very underrated plant. Like if you put them into a nice pot, they actually perform beautifully. They have lovely flowers, happens to dangle upside down mostly, and those, cute lanterns. There's a little crossover, we think, with tomatillo, and Chinese lanterns may also host a whole series. I think, again, another 3 species. But the native physalis, that's, right up there with some of these other plants. I should also point out that any of these specialist plants often are just as good a host to the generalists as the the more widely planted kinds of species of plants, like mountain mint or something. I can't be absolute about that, but you're not, decreasing everything else by planting some of these specialists. We mentioned this. For milkweed, it's all about nectar production. There's several other species of plants that are nectar producers, and they don't contribute pollen, but they can be important components. And as we know from the monarch story, other species of insects are hosted by some of these non-blooming or, straight nectar plants. So basically all species have a role and often have an entire downstream set of communities that are supported by that species or their their genera kin. Ironweeds, Melissodes reticulatus, I should say, just change that name on the ending. Another good one. Which of the species does it use? Hard to say. Other species come in, but for example, not bumblebees. So there's, I really have to watch myself because there's so many interesting stories. Holly has specialists, but it also, if you look at that bloom, it's very simple, very open, easy to access. It's a generalist strategy with a couple of species that are associated with the shrub species. Frost asters, really nasty pollen in general, but has a whole set of bees that are supported only by these frost aster groups. What the divisions are within frost aster, what are the best ones, remains to be seen. We know so little about the individual groups. Wild beans, so this is something we tend to not think a lot about. And again, I'm just presenting some vignettes here of these species, and they're eastern because I'm familiar with those. Out west, you're talking about things like creosote bush and the cacti, hosting in just this same sort of way a lot of diversity of bees that are not the types that are coming to a lot of the plantings that are going on. So really rare bees that we are finding by spending a lot of time looking for are fuzzy beans and, or is it fuzzy peas, and some of the pea family vines. We look at Monarda. Everyone loves Monardas. Monarda is a good generic plant, and deer often don't like it because it's a mint. But in this particular case, this species here, Protandina abdominalis, only goes to one species of Monarda, or at least in the east it does. And there may be other species in the Midwest and West that it is associated with. And sometimes, really rare, in this case, another sand specialist, because Monarda punctata is a species of destitute lands. And in the West, that can be a weedy lot. In the East, it tends to be high value, deep sand spots. And that species shows up. But if you plant cornflower, then that species is not going to come in. Woodland sunflowers, another interesting example, more efficacious in the mountain areas where you have, it particularly loves woodland edges, which is probably naturally related to, and there's a bee, this species here, Jugatorium, Paranthidium jugatorium. Now doesn't trip off your tongue. In very broad senses, we have groups like the large yellow composites that almost always add a big component of rarity and specialist bees, no matter which species you choose. And it's we're suffering from a yellow composite dearth in the country because our patterns of herbiciding, our patterns of mowing, what we favor tends to unfavor the perennial large yellow composites. So should be a campaign somewhere in there. You have species like Andrena helianthiformis that obviously, just from the name, have relationships. The native thistles, underrated in terms of horticultural elements, and certainly attacked by everyone inadvertently because of just a lot of thistle hate by farmers and agriculturalists and county extension agents who are blind to the fact that many of the native species are not invasive and are biennial species. Cirsium horridulum, this yellow jobber here, only grows a couple feet, loves deep sand, has bees, gigantic osmia bees that only go to it, is one of my favorites, and I would love to see a campaign of creating more habitat filled with Cirsium horridulum, and what a spectacular garden plant to have. You have a lot of bindweed issues and morning glory issues in large parts of the country. We do have native ones. So this man root or man of the earth, I think it's called both, Ipomaea pandurata. It can be weedy in the deep south. Up north, it tends not to be. It's something that I think should be planted, certainly should supplant any of the garden morning glory types. It's always white, but it's quite large and showy. Big support of bees, some of the bees like Bombus pennsylvanicus, some of the uncommon bumblebees, but also Cimolobus ipomaea. So that's a bee that is almost never seen, comes out obviously in the morning and doesn't show up the rest of the day. So as I mentioned, when we talk about saving bees, we're really talking about saving the pollen. So it's almost all, with a few exceptions, and usually they're lower down on the list of things to deal with. you're dealing with lack of biodiversity, loss of biodiversity, and selection of plant communities as creating the problems or the benefits to bees in any particular area. And a very general thing, because, oh my gosh, there's so much information that we don't know and it's complicated. So a diversity of native plants will yield almost automatically a diversity of native bees. And so just a couple of times, so just to show some of these different ways that bees are impacted by floral communities early in the spring in particular, there's an entirely different set of priorities. So in February in the mid-Atlantic area, almost nothing is out, but red maple is, and it becomes a keystone source of pollen and nectar for a lot of these very early species who will jump up there and then go back to bed if the weather gets cold again. If we look at March, this is a slide taken from another talk, we're looking at like what is going to be out in the environment that will provide the queens of bumblebees, their initial food sources, and that largely becomes woodlands. So woodlands become keystones in a lot of environments because they harbor spring blooming vernal plants and also spring blooming shrubs and short trees that will get the bumblebee populations going, and then they migrate out and into the surrounding fields or the edges of woods in some cases later in the year. Again, so many strategies to think about when you're dividing up the bee world, but there's still this plant-based part of it. Willow, that was a repeat slide, so we're going to skip over willows. Forest bees, so you both have the sweet soil, bottomland communities, and then you have the acidic pine, spruce kinds of communities. One is more towards the vernal herbaceous layer as providing a lot of that stuff, but also amelanchiers and several other shrubs. And then you have the ericaceous communities of these forests, these open forests. And if you look at these forests, you often have a repressed layer of these ericaceous shrubs, and they are waiting for a disturbance factor to open up and really produce heavy bloom and do a growth spurt and provide pollen and nectar to bees. Even if you have an ericaceous understory, often is not particularly active for bees because almost nothing is blooming because the plants are just barely hanging on. So a lot of the action would be in these kinds of environments that could be generated by lawn edges for these forested species because they'll bloom there. Okay, I think we're wrapping up the species stuff, but here's just an interesting list that always, surprised, I think surprises a lot of people. You have things like dodder, a bunch of things we've talked about already, prickly pear, California poppy, crinkle mat out west, gourds, morning glory, all with bees that only go to that particular group. When we look at some of these strategies for bringing in bees, there is this element which really isn't well studied, which has to do with sort of long-term establishment of plant communities, creating their own I would say their own, trajectory or momentum for the bee communities. In other words, there's large enough plantings, they've been there a long enough time. At some point, hopefully some of these uncommon bees blunder because they do a lot of dispersal over long distances until they either find what they need or they're dead. And then they build up their populations within that area. So Mount Cuba, many of you know Mount Cuba, wonderful both research and garden arboretum in northern Delaware, very much emphasizing spring plantings of native plants. And a researcher, Matt Sarver, went in there and looked at these plants, cross-referenced against the list of species that we have going on. And he found a whole series of very cool rare, super rare bees. Andrena pulmonii, for example, not found in the area. The nearest records was the border of Ohio and West Virginia. So lots to see and do in these kinds of environments, and you build it and they will come, but it might take a while. Again, we don't really know for that to pile up. Golden ragwort, a great Pukara, great species group. It turns out the species matter. So within Pukara, there are species that have specialist bees and species of Pukara that have basically nothing. So again, we look at, our deficit in understanding what are the important groups and species out there in the world. Picture of Andrena gardneri, and its nest parasite, which hadn't been seen in decades and decades and decades, Nomada senecio. And that is, just one of these bonuses. There are other species involved with these plants than simply the ones that take the pollen off the top. Another little story, Pukara. So a lot of the Pukara plantings are some bastard mix of European and hybrids and American species that get plunked around commercial plantings. But it turns out the straight species have, at least the spring blooming straight species, have a bee, Calides estivalis, that goes to it that were on the list of maybe the species isn't around anymore list. And then it turns out that when people started looking for it, they found it again. A gal here, Wendy Brister, who was associated with Cavanagh's nursery, brought in a few, and they do a lot of native plant types of activities. She's their specialist. She planted at her house, just a few of these plants, sent me a picture of a bee that she didn't recognize. Turned out it was Calides estivalis. And I visited her house, and it was not, it was a lovely house, but it was surrounded by other houses, and it was not in some pristine special area. So plantings within your yard, within your facility, in the middle of DC, for example, are places that make a difference, and these bees will show up, and you will be surprised because, again, of this dispersal. Here's another interesting one. Chinkapin, we just learned that chinkapin and also when we started looking at the residual orchards for American chestnut, same genus, have a bee, Andrena renyi, that had not been seen in, 60, 70 years. And it turns out that the story was it hadn't been seen because it's a specialist on that group. And no one put that together a long time ago. But once we started looking at pollination in those impacted plant genera, that along with all kinds of cool weevils and everything else. Oh, here's a redundant slide. There were, and another one. So there's at the rarely do we see something at the tree level that has specialist bees, but adding to the specialness of chestnuts is a specialist bee. So when we start looking in the fall, we get a bunch of other specialists that don't come out. So these bees that are specialists are only coming out during the window in which their plant species is inhabiting. And so we'll take these are just some examples. If we look at goldenrods, Mount Cuba, again, we just were recently visiting, has a big goldenrod trial. They have many species, and we started getting them interested in looking at their bumblebees more specifically. And sure enough, if you look at just at bumblebees, despite all the species being in the same place, even though they have, I think at the time they had like 17 species blooming, all the bumblebees were only on 2 species of goldenrod group. So it was on the oligoneuron group, which I guess is sometimes a genus, sometimes not a genus, in terms of people's thinking about it. But even within this group that pollinator specialists tend to think of as a whole, so solidagos, goldenrods, you have lots of different possibilities. If you look at the architecture of these goldenrods, you'll see like they're amazingly different. even at the blossom level. So no surprise, but this is the kind of thing that we just don't know. We just say, oh, goldenrods are good, but they may or may not be. So in some of these lawn-like areas or weedy areas, you have a need to really knock back stilt grass, and you need some aggressive native plants. So I'll just give you a couple examples. Heliopsis, smooth oxeye, it self-spreads. It can beat up stilt grass even. It's a really awesome bumblebee provider, and it works with several other groups of native bees too. We also see this with ashy sunflower is another one that provides a lot of good pollen and nectar and can push out a lot of the invasives more on the dry side of, oh, look, it's moving, of things. If we ask questions like, is it better when we're getting into the details of flipping lawns, is it better to provide seed or plugs? If you're working in small spaces, so you're doing a pollinator meadow in front of an institution or in a house, rather than a large set of acreages, almost always you're going to want to use plugs rather than seeds, because you have a weed seed bed that's unbelievable inside that lawn area, even if you just desodded it. So recommendation is go that way, unless you're working at a really large scale, and then that's a whole other set of strategies. So here's a YouTube link, and I really, so it's too long to write down, but if you look at Dr. Linda Chalker-Scott's work at Oregon State Extension, she's done a lot of really interesting work on mulches and their positives and negatives. So when we think about flipping an area into pollinator plantings, there is a whole, I've seen numerous talks where people say, oh, don't use mulch because bees can't nest through mulch. Well, first of all, while largely true, there are a few species that will nest in a mulch bed. But the other thing is bees have wings. You're not going to put in so much mulch that those bees can't come in, just like they go over water to get to the pickleweed, and fly back out and find a place to nest outside the mulch area. So mulch is really a key ingredient to being successful in creating pollinator gardens and not just creating weedy areas. Dr. Chalker-Scott talks about a lot of different things, but just to summarize, bark is a no in large case because it's too waxy. It just sheds off a lot of the water. Nutshells don't absorb much water. These are all possible mulches. Living mulches, so let's see. I can't remember what's the name of the person who wrote the book that I should remember. Anyway, she is a big proponent of putting in basically what would amounts to a lower level of mulches of living plants that form ground cover that beat up the weeds and allow the upper story to be successful. Anything like landscape cloth, putting down plastic or rubber is a no. The soil can't breathe, and then you have to deal with taking away and pulling up the material that was down there. I'll give you one example that where that you could think about using them and under some circumstances. Cardboard and newspaper, surprisingly, since everyone seems to be an advocate of putting that down first, is a no, because it she uses the example of like take a wet piece of newspaper and put it over your face and try and breathe through that. So it largely prevents water from moving back and forth. It forms a basically compact waterproof layer. If it dries out, it's even worse. Stone is interesting. You can use stone in certain kinds of places, maybe because you want to have the look, and it becomes a so constructed wetlands often have stone on the top. You can plant right through that to the soil area underneath, or the wetland area, if that's how it works, and have great success. And then the plants, weeds and things that form in the upper level of these stone layers, one, it's it's a harsh environment, so relatively few weeds invade. And if they do invade, they're easy to pull out. So weird circumstances that can work. Otherwise, if you just have scattered rocks to have a visual, round rocks to line your driveway, you're going to end up having to herbicide it all the time. So stone isn't a answer to everything. Sawdust compacts too much. Same reason that you wouldn't use cardboard and newspaper. Would be also a no. You can look at establishing from lawns or other environments pollinator plantings by basically herbiciding everything, which is often a good way, is a possible way to start. But you're also impacting the soil microfauna by dropping all those herbicides down there. So that's a big negative. Additionally, then if you just try to herbicide after that, you're really messing too much with the system, and ultimately the planted plants, the weeds will come back in. They will use up they're just better at competing, and it'll beat up your native plants. And what good is that? So the real answer is mulch. Here is our, as of a few years ago, we've eaten up a lot of this, is our mulch compound from chips from nearby chip trucks who are often looking for places to drop their chips. And we will do, here's an example in my yard where I have a patch here, and you can see there's, what is that? Parthenosensis, quinquefolia, what is that? Anyway, that plant there at the front bottom and the asters at the back, and the rest is sort of grass and a mix of things. But I can tell you that those plants, since I didn't digging out the roots, those come back and they'll punch up through the mulch. But the basic way that this works is you take a patch of lawn or lawn-like environment and you weed whack the hell out of it. So you're taking it down to dirt if you can, and then you immediately dump inches. So we're talking 8 to 12 inches of mulch on top of that area. And then you plant through it. So you're not planting in the mulch, you're digging through the mulch. Sometimes you have to make a little cone and planting into the dirt below your perennials, or it could be annuals too. And then you can walk away. So I don't have my final, but this in 1 year became a gigantic jungle of plants. You don't have to worry about fertilizer. The chips both create a soil changing environment for the fungal communities and bacteria that are important to soil health. You can take ground that formerly was basically like a brick, and it will turn into something that in a few years you can drop a spade or a fork right through and you have wonderful soil. And soil is going to be key to this whole thing. The other times, so at the lab, we have circumstances where we have so many woody plants like poison ivy, every invasive woody vine are living in these environments that were prior to our occupancy mode once a year, that what we've done is also chip, but we'll also put down underneath the chips initially, we put down rubber matting and other things that the woody plants can't get up through, or they have to go out laterally, making them easier to pull. So we'll do that year one, and then we'll pull out the matting and other things that have helped now repress the woody plants in year two. So you can use some of these materials, but it's not a uniform environment. We're not leaving it in place. It's just in a tough environment where you have and don't feel like grubbing, or can't because there's not enough, or you don't have time to hire someone to rototill it. It's a good thing sometimes to drop down some heavy duty cover, but pull it afterwards. So here is just another example. This is the bee lab, and that's the soil. We mulched everything. We planted a few things in, and it looks like I have a visual here. And you can see this is year 2 that they're coming up in the spring. And this is year 3 this year. Or no, that's the end of year 2. And this is year 3. And now we're actually have too much material in there. We're going to tear almost all of it out and move some of the aggressive plants to new spots. But that was overturned subsoil from a septic tank that was just unbelievably bad. No fertilizer, no nothing, just chips, and pretty much everything grew. We also did that in our front entrance. This is 2 years old. This is just a few days ago. This was a area that was mown. It was all weeds, and it had been layers of gravel had been put down to act as sort of a staging area for cars at different times. So it was basically a parking lot. Same thing. We just came in. We actually had a tractor with a rototiller attachment on the back and just rototilled up all the crabgrass a couple of times and then buried it in mulch. The first 6 feet were done just this year. And that's all this new, and the ones in the back were planted 2 years ago. And you can see that it's already a healthy environment. I'm wrapping up now. And this is a picture of our guest house at my house. And what I am an advocate for is using weed whackers rather than lawnmowers as your tool for creating small spots of lawn, and also using them to edit. So the idea is that you keep places around your house in good condition, and your paths, your edges with your neighbors, your driveways, and you do it in a way that clearly defines the interior spaces, which can be almost any naturalized kind of place. And the neighborhood will find that acceptable. What they won't find acceptable is if you did that to the entire yard, because it looks like you have abandoned it. So I'm an advocate for weed whackers. They're very good at editing out plants. I put a brush blade on the tip of it at the end of the season, and I just cut everything down to about 8 inches. Allows bees to nest in the ends of those hollow stems the following year. And I can, again, present a nice, neat, and tidy environment to the neighborhood. Here, this is the second to last slide. I'm pointing out that this coming year, we've started this year, but we've started really getting into looking at plants that support bumblebees and actually quantifying that. So there's a lot of lists for, these are important bumblebee plants, and this is a list based on collecting and talking with other people. But we are starting a whole bunch of projects where we're going to be measuring the use of these plants by bumblebees and eventually all species, and comparing that to what other plants were available to be used. So we get a more complete picture of both bumblebee use, but also as to what plants are most supportive of bumblebee populations, because it's contextual. If you only have a few plants, they're going to use what they can. And if they have a rich environment, they're going to be much more picky. That's it. I don't know. I tend to talk too long. So I'm going to punt this back to Patricia and ask her what we should do next, whether we have time for questions. But here's my contact information, and I'm glad to send more material to people who are interested. And if people are interested, they can stop by the lab, and we will put them to work and make them a volunteer all at the same time.
Fabulous. Sam, you stopped right on cue in time for 15 minutes of Q&A, so thank you. I think one of the take-home messages I heard from your rotation to take a cue from the native plant communities in your area and to include a range of native species in your lawns. Let's go right to some of the questions or comments that were mentioned. And if others have questions, you can either raise your hands or put them in the chat.
And let's go ahead and turn off all video except for the presenter, please.
So one person mentions the challenge I have seen is seed providers, seed suppliers provide generic pollinators that may not be endemic plant species seasons we do not use, or the plants are regionally invasive. And I think you did speak to that. Is there anything else you'd comment on there?
Yeah, that's pretty common. So even among the sophisticated plant suppliers, if you cross-reference their planting list to the region that they are suggesting it be planted, you'll see that a lot of, if they're really good, there won't be any non-native plants, but there'll be a lot of out-of-range plants where that species may not normally occur within the region or is regionally rare. I think in those cases, we're more talking about that their list is relatively short, so they can't support the entire community. And you also have, as a management tool, if we're talking something more than lawns, you certainly can manipulate the existing environment to augment the plant communities that already are existing there. You can also, it's a big topic and a long topic, and some people are not interested in doing that. You can collect your own seeds and grow your own plants. And we here at Patuxent, we provide space for regional groups who are interested in doing that, but don't have what we have, which is an automatic watering system. So we'll provide that to people.
Fabulous. And I think before we go, I want to make sure that you do remind people just where you're located and how to reach you there at Patuxent.
Yeah.
I mean, and they could email you as well.
Yeah.
Let's see, there was a question about recommending a source for a plant list by geographic region, and I'd like to go ahead and take a stab at answering that and then allow Sam, of course, to embellish. But very first, because a lot of them are actually creating regionally appropriate planting lists. And they really are, they're your botanical experts really at the local level. Keep pollinators and mind. There's also pollinator eco-regional planting guides that were developed by the North American Pollinator group. I don't know, Sam, how you feel about those. I know that Plant Conservation Alliance helped inform the guides to some extent. Yeah. Any other comments there, Sam?
Yeah, familiar with those. And I think what's happening is we're evolving. Those were now are, I don't know, I want to say at least 5+ years old. And we didn't have as much information as we even have now in terms of some of the issues, like that there are so many of these bees that are specialists, and also what the more important plants are, and also the availability of in the commercial realm is expanding for a lot of these plant species, as are more groups who are doing in a collective way or individually growing their own plants. So backing up to your the NABC plant lists, those are good, and they are there tend to be more towards the common species, and they're more towards the generalist, supportive of generous plant groups than what we would like to see more of now, which, I alluded to. And the reference material that I would use is not so much a planting list in its direct form, but those lists that Jared Fowler put together are what I would call essentially planting lists.
Thank you, Sam. Another comment or question was, what was that good Pukara species that you mentioned?
Yeah, there's a couple, and there's probably more, because if you look at like BONAP's maps of Pukara species across the U.S. and you match it against Andrena gardneri, there's no one particular place that they all, nothing conforms everywhere. So The Smalls ragwort is definitely one that should be on most people's list in the East. We tend to plant Pukara. I think it's not Anonymous, I think is another important one, but I think we plant Pukara aureus. I think it's aureus. It's the one that goes up to the northeast, and that's, I think, the one most commonly available in the trade or just swapped about. But a couple of those others, I think, are more the ticket for the uncommon species. And there's so a weird one is the hairy, whatever the common name is, hairy ragwort, Pukara tenuiflora, I believe it is. It's along the coastal plain. It's a weird plant. It looks great. I never find anything on it though. So that's the kind of thing we're going to be becoming more and more sophisticated in what plants we are asking people to plant and to think about as we go along.
Fabulous, Sam. And somebody is sharing their screen with the group, and we could see your email. You might want to stop sharing. Or Maggie, if you could grab the.
We do have time for some questions. Let me please continue with what was posted in the chat. Let's see. Somebody asked whether Dr. Chalker or other could elaborate on what constitutes a successful living mulch. So is there a sort of a website or someplace you would send people to?
There's a good book. I have the book somewhere and I can't remember what it is, but it's a Eastern author, Claudia Vest. There we go. And Vest would be W-E-S-T, West, but I think it's pronounced Vest. And so she emphasizes much closer plantings, so instead of putting in a lot of mulch and spacing things apart and having like seeing the mulch all the time, planting closer and planting ground cover types of plants like wild strawberry or ragworts and some of the really low asters. And there's a variety of things that you can put down below the level of the taller plants and allowing that community to basically crowd out your weeds and invasives as a living mulch. I think more groups are doing that, so I would, encourage people to Google that.
Yes, and somebody did post the name of that book, Planting in a Post-Wild World,
Yep.
Which is the one I think you're referring to. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, there was a question about how deep should the mulch be when you have trees with their feeder roots in the same area?
Yeah, so I'm not going to answer completely here, but the Oregon group has done a whole bunch of tree studies where they look at bringing in trees into environments. And they also use thick sheet layers of mulch too. I think one of the issues is that people tend to mound mulch up in lawn environments around the bases of trees. The trees then will, so that mulch then begins to decompose and create its own upper level soil. And the trees begin to put out roots and weird things happen in that bark area of the upper part of the tree, and the tree collapses at some point. What the Oregon group and I think others should think about is putting out sheets of wood chips prior to planting in trees, and then either walking away or adding mulch periodically. But most of the idea is to give them a leg up in these environments that they're not garden environments per se. They could be, I suppose. But the idea is to let them establish well without every weed and its mother coming in and pulling out the energy and interacting with the roots. It gives them a chance. And the mulch, again, recreates and recovers the soil, because a lot of times these soils are really, let's call them corrupt. They have, in addition to maybe just simply low nutrients, they're hard panned, they're clay, the subsoil has been turned over on top. They have, if they were agricultural fields or they were lawn that was heavy on the chemicals, they may be more or less dead. So the mulch provides a way to allow the soil to recover. It's loose enough that air and oxygen can move between the soil and the upper surfaces, and it keeps the moisture, as a mulch would do, in and around the roots. And then the decomposition and the encouragement of fungal communities really has all kinds of side benefits to the growing plants also.
Okay, fabulous. Couple more questions here. One is that you mentioned chestnuts have specialist bee. What's happening with that bee in light of the chestnut blight?
Yeah, so the sort of salvation probably for a whole series of specialist chestnut species. So there were moths, there were our weevils, really spectacular weevils. If you can imagine a weevil that has to get through all that spiny coat, and probably several other species that I'm not recalling. And some of them may have disappeared. It's also a problem. No one looks for these things any longer. And they do reappear once people look. And the other is that they seem to at least somewhat cross between chinkapin. I'm going to sneeze. Sorry about that. So chinkapin has really kept a lot of these communities probably going. Chinkapin, as far as I know, is susceptible to the blight or whatever it's called on the chestnut, but they have a shorter cycle and can hide better, and they're still around. I believe they have also declined, so it's a worthy cause to be planting chinkapins. You need to plant their seeds right away. You can't like store them and then plant them in the next year. You have to gather them when they fall and then plant right off the bat. But it should be something that we encourage in general. So chestnuts, when people have looked, at least in the southern chestnut orchards, and there's now been a fair number of people who've done that, they essentially almost always find the Andrena rennie. I looked at one just down the road from me, like, oh, and went in, and right away there was that bee. So there's just not that many people looking for bees. So some of this is hidden in plain sight kinds of operations. A lot of people don't even think of chestnuts as supporting insects or being insect pollinated. So it seems to have a combination effect, but it certainly is insect pollinated.
Great points there. Two more questions. I'll ask them in succession. And one, I'm going to just reverse the order. What bee is the specialist on daughter, and where is a good place to get photos of bees for ID? Set me up, Sam.
Okay, so daughter has a species, again, a really cool story that we're just learning about recently. It was a bee called Calides ciliatus. So a lot of Calides, which are cellophane bees, are specialists. Calides ciliatus had only been collected a handful of times. So it was, by anyone's measure, a really, really rare bee. And but again, no one had a clear picture of what it was doing in the environment. And if you know daughter, it's not like got a very spectacular bloom, and it tends to be like, daughter. And who would think that it would be a place to, one, collect bees on, and two, would have anything particularly specialist, that there would be any kind of special relationship. But it's true, they do. And So right now it's not clear. There's many species of dodder, like how common it is. The bees collected to date have been associated with dodder in wetland environments. In the Maryland area, one in Wisconsin recently, and the rest are over 100 years old. So more to learn, and we're encouraging people to look and collect things on dodder, but there's just not that many people, so it may take us a while. Oh, and the other question was photos, and so we, if you go to @USGSBIML, that's our handle on social media, and we actually, if I could sell.
I lost your audio.
I think I hit something on my computer. So I'll say the pictures, we maintain a catalog of 5,000 plus pictures, and we're trying to accumulate pictures of all the bees in North America. And those are available on our social media handle at Flickr. That's where the best ones. I can send you details on downloading, which is at USGS BIML, Bee Inventory and Monitoring Lab. And that also, if you go to our Instagram account and follow us there, we tell a lot of very detailed stories. It's basically a blog about bees and flowers and other insects too, that we, here we have very little time to get into, but I tend to go on and on there. So the pictures are taken with specialized equipment, and they will blow up the size of a billboard. If you are so moved to blow something up to the size of a billboard, just send me a picture. But they can be used in any way you want. We don't ask you to even ask us permission. We're going to give you permission to sell them, use them. You can use them in your own work. And on Discover Life, we add the pictures for each of the bee species to a species page. So Discover Life is where we do our identification guides, which are technical, not popular, so you need a microscope. We also do, just going down that alley, Claire Maffey and I, but mostly Claire, is running a online identification project every Wednesday, where we get online and we talk about how to identify the species in North America. And I think we've got 19 sessions now, something like that, and they're available on the videos, or for each of those sessions is available to anyone who wants to download them too. I could go on and on.
Fabulous. And I'll just point out that for the last 15 or 20 minutes, we'll have a roundtable and anyone can provide information on current activities. But before we move to that, so I'm encouraging folks to stay on the line. Let's go ahead and answer this last question that came, just because I know that plastic is a big issue right now. But one of the speakers asked about don't weed whackers put plastic into the environment? So have you heard anything about that, Sam?
Well, they certainly do. Yeah, we know how they work. Well, I should back up. So if you have a weed whacker that has a brush blade on it, that's a metal blade. So, and it doesn't do a great job in terms of like making a lawn-like environment, but oh my gosh, it's my tool of choice if I'm getting rid of invasive shrubs, or I just need to clear all the blackberries out, or whatever I'm doing. It's a great manipulator of the environment. The plastic ones, yeah, you lose, it's abrading the tips, and that's in the environment. I don't know anyone who's studied what happens to weed whacker tips, but it's probably not like the greatest thing ever, but nor is it a whole lot of different than perhaps, our regular plastic litter. I don't know the consequences, in other words.
Great. Well, something certainly to keep in mind. I mean, it seems everything we try to do affects some other system.
Right. Yeah.
So, well, thank you for speaking to us today. I hope that Maggie will work with you to make sure we captured all of your links and resources that you shared so that we can send that back out to everybody who participated today.
I'll try to give Maggie a full link list. And so you can,
That would be fabulous. Thank you. Thank you so much. So if we can all just give Sam a round of applause. Thank you for speaking to us today. And while we're more into the next part of our meeting, which is the Native Plants Roundtable, in which we ask all participants to provide information on any events or updates, research projects going on related to native plants. And with that, I will start us off by mentioning something. Hopefully you all can hear me okay. I'll mention that the 2021 Natural Areas Conference is planned for October 19th. That's also my birthday. Just seeing if you're paying attention. The theme is Life from the Ashes, exploring the impact of prescribed and natural fire on insects and other invertebrates. Looks like it'll be an interesting meeting. I'll post the link to that, and it's going to come out really funny. Sorry about that. But the early bird prices, they do end today. And registration ends, the prices are still reasonable because it is a virtual meeting. Now I'd like to open it up and turn to anyone else on the meeting. If you'd like to raise your hand, or just let's see if we get raised. If not, people can just open up their name, your affiliation, and you have to provide us an update.